Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about representational, abstract, and, not or, non-representational artworks and how to tell the difference. So I used to assume the students, like if I said blah, 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 representational, abstract, non-representational, that they would immediately know what I was talking about. But that was silly, and nobody should assume anything. So so just quickly, we're just going to look, and I'm not going to explain yet, but we see on the left a painting by Picasso that's representational, and it's of his mother. In the middle, we see an abstract painting by Picasso, and we still see a figure in it, but it's not as realistic looking, certainly by any means, as the one on the left. And then on the right, we see a painting by Juan Moreau, and it is non-representational or non-objective because we don't see, like, there's no recognizable figures or objects or things that have to do with the natural world. There are shapes and lines and colors. So when an artist draws or sculpts or paints something in a representational style, they're trying to make it look as much like the real thing as possible, as realistic as possible. So on the right, we have a photograph of Terrence Nance, and on the left, we have a painting of Terrence Nance by Kehinde Wiley. And he's trying his best, and he does a really good job of making Terrence Nance look as realistic as possible. He's got highlights on his face and shadows, and his face looks three-dimensional, and his hair looks like fairly real, and his clothes are a little exaggerated, but those are like some fancy clothes that he's wearing. He has wrinkles and highlights and shadows on the clothing as well. So that's representational. But there's a thing a caveat that I must say is that artists are human. And so really, no matter how hard they try to make something look perfect, that's not possible, like, for us to make things look exactly like they do in real life. They might come close, but it's impossible to make it look completely realistic. So, and also what it depends on is what kind of material they're working on. So it's easier to paint or draw something to look realistic if you have the skills than it is to make something out of clay or bronze that looks perfectly realistic, because of the material is a little harder in the case of clay to work with, and in the case of bronze, like, once you pour that bronze into the mold, it's not malleable, so you can't change things up to make it look more realistic. So, but in this case, Mark Mellon's really trying really hard to make the sculptor Eli Vessel look as realistic as possible. So when you see an artwork and it looks as realistic as the artist could possibly make it, that's representational. So abstract is a little harder concept to get, in part because for so long and so often, people have misused the term abstract. They'll call something abstract, but it's most cases it's probably non-representational. So, like, if you go to gallery furniture and you say, I want an abstract painting, they're going to show you a non-representational painting. So the key takeaway with abstract is that the artist is still depicting figures, objects, space, but in a way that's not realistic. So it might be more stylized or exaggerated or simplified. It might be like made into geometric shapes, or the artist might use whatever colors they want arbitrarily. So let's look at some abstract art. So these are 3 paintings that Picasso did of his model and lover, Jacqueline Roque. I'm sure I said that wrong. and they're all abstract, but some of them look slightly more realistic than others. Yet they're still abstracted. So let's look at the one in the middle first. So in this painting, here's a photograph of her on the right. He's exaggerated the size of her eyes, so they're really big. He's kind of exaggerated the length of her face and made it more narrow than it would be in real life. When he's drawn in her clothes, her hat, her ribbon, her dress, he's just done it really quickly. He's like, here's the line, I'm gonna color blue as a hat. Here's another line, I'm gonna color it blue, it's a ribbon. So he's like doing all of this super quickly, and like, look at her neck. If your neck was that thin and you had a regular sized person head, your neck would break because your head would be too heavy. So he's just like simplifying shapes, like exaggerating some shapes, and he's making some things look less three-dimensional. Like her face looks pretty 3D, but the hat, it's just shapes. So some artworks can kind of verge on being somewhere between abstract and realistic. So we're going to look at this painting by Diego Rivera of the Liberation of the Peon. And it looks pretty realistic, but until you start really looking at things. And like, we're going to zoom in on a couple of areas, but there are other areas as well. So when we go to the background and we look at those buildings, they're not three-dimensional looking. They're just like rectangle, 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 rectangle. And then the mountains are like, boop, that's a mountain. And we know mountains have more variations and more contours and more shapes, more things going on than just that little boop, boop, here's a shape, I'm colored in tan, it's a mountain. And then when we look at the bodies, for example, like this man's body, the length of it is exaggerated. And then we look at the shape of this guy's arms, they're kind of more like you hooked two toilet paper rolls together and then put a sleeve over it. So they're also like, they don't have all the nuances and like muscles and contours that a real arm would have. So part of the reason why he's done this is because that's the way, his style, but also he's working in fresco, and you're working with wet plaster and pigment, and you can only fill in a certain amount of space at a time before it dries. So things have to be made into these kind of more simplified shapes and forms. So other works aren't easily recognized as abstract, like they kind of verging on non-representational, but they're still abstract. So this is Paul Cézanne's is like the same Victory Mountain, and we're looking at this, and this is all just like kind of almost regulated to these blocks and shapes of different colors. But if we look in the far background, there's a mountain in the sky. We look in the middle ground, if we really look at it, we can see buildings and trees and fields, and then we look up closer, and what's up close are supposed to be trees, but he's abstracted it into blocks and shapes of different colors. And some artworks are so abstracted, they look non-representational at first glance. So we talked about the knife grinder, Malevich's knife grinder, a little bit in the chapter. This is on the left. This is like one of those Cubo futuristic paintings that a lot of people adopted the style in Russia at the time. And this knife grinder, he's there if you really look, but it's just been made into these exaggerated and fragmented shapes and colors. And then if we look on the far right, there's a lithograph by Kandinsky, who's a contemporary Malevich, and he's like, this is called Stars, and if you look in there, you think about it a whole lot, maybe you could see the the universe and planets and stuff. And it's also like the shape, the outer shape's based on the form of an amoeba or like a one-cell creature. But it's like it's been like things have been made into simple shapes and simple flat fields of color. There's no highlights, no shadows or anything like that. There's just things are filled in with color. So now we're going to go to non-representational, and that is an artwork that makes no visible reference to the natural world, no recognizable subject matter. So in other words, the object is not depicting figures and objects, but they're dealing with things like formal issues such as line or color, shape, pattern, texture, or they could be dealing with emotional or expressive content, or they could be working with the inherent qualities of a material medium, and that means like how whatever medium, like paint or oil paint or acrylic or watercolor or bronze or whatever they're using, just how that particular medium works and how it what happens to it when you do certain things to it. So it's just like kind of like the confines of a certain medium, like you're just experimenting with that. Oh, here it is. I just said the same thing again. So artist mediums are like acrylic paint, woodcut prints, stone sculptures, videotape. I left out a comma there. And so an inherent quality of oil paint is it's light reflective. And then soft wood's easy to carve, but it can splinter. Hardwood's harder to cut, but you can get more fine details in it. So, et cetera, et cetera. So some non-representational art deals strictly with the basic formal elements. So in this Kandinsky painting, he's got colors, he's got all sorts of lines and thicknesses of lines, he's got geometric shapes, he has overlapping. So that's a way of depicting space, which is also important to this image. But that image is, you can't look at that image and go, oh yeah, this is about my trip downtown when and then there was a wreck. So it's not about anything specific. It's more about colors, lines, shapes, things like that. So Sonia Delaunay, she's somebody else. She expressed herself through geometric shapes and color in her design work and her artworks, and it's non-representational. It's not about like, oh look on the right, oh, that's my tablecloth. It's not your tablecloth, or it's just about those shapes and colors. So kente cloth is another kind of cloth that's non-representational. So shapes and colors and lines, but it's colors and patterns. But in this particular case, though all those shapes and lines have symbolic meaning to them, but they're not you're not looking at that going like, oh, here's a picture of a chicken. It's not anything like, we don't see anything recognizable in it. Although if you were from that culture, or you would know what all that symbolism means. So other non-representational work, this is a way of expressing motion. So Robert Motherwell, he painted a series of 100 paintings, Elegy to the Spanish Republic, and these paintings are about how sad he is. It was like they're like a funeral song to all the people that died during the Spanish Civil War. But again, they have more to do with the emotion of that event. And then other non-representational works, the artist might say like, what would happen if I did X, Y, Z with my materials? And so Pollock might have asked himself this question: what happens when you fling and drip paint as you move it around the canvas? And personally, I think what happens is you get a crummy looking painting, but they're worth millions and millions of dollars. So like this particular artist, she does non-representational work. And what happens when when clay is fired or dried, it can, if you don't handle it right, it can explode or crack or break. And so like rather than fight those qualities in her work, she's able to like embrace them. Like, so she just let like all the bad stuff that can happen to clay happen to it and made that part of her artwork. So this is also non-representational. So not all non-representational work is good. Some of it's pretty crappy. But in a later chapter, we'll learn that you'll begin to understand that art is not necessarily strictly in the eye of the beholder, but in the artist's heart and intellect as well. Thank you for listening to me.